The morning sun shone brightly over the small town of Riverdale, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of Main Street. Harold Jenkins adjusted his glasses and squinted at his watch as he pushed open the heavy glass door of Walker's Pharmacy. The little bell above the door jingled, announcing his arrival. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," called Rita from behind the counter. Her cheerful voice carried across the nearly empty store. At just past 9 in the morning, the place was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator units and the distant sound of a radio playing oldies from the back office. "Morning, Rita," Harold replied, his voice slightly rough around the edges. 6 months after his stroke, his speech still sometimes caught in his throat, like words getting tangled in a fishing net before they could escape. "Just here to pick up my prescription." Rita nodded, her salt and pepper curls bouncing slightly. "Got it right here. Doc called it in yesterday." She slid a small white paper bag across the counter. "How are you feeling these days?" Harold shrugged his thin shoulders beneath his worn plaid button-up. "Can't complain too much. The physical therapy is helping with my left side." He flexed his fingers to demonstrate, though the movement was still noticeably stiffer on that side. "Memory's giving me some trouble still, and the words, well, they don't always come when I call for them." "You're doing great, Mr. Jenkins," Rita assured him, her eyes warm with genuine concern. She'd known him for over 30 years, since she was a student in his high school history class. "Just take it one day at a time." Harold nodded, grateful for her kindness. At 81, he'd become all too familiar with the way some people's eyes glazed over when they spoke to him, as if his age and his recent health troubles had somehow made him invisible or less worthy of their full attention. After paying for his medication, Harold carefully tucked the paper bag into the front pocket of his light jacket and made his way back to his car. The 1998 Buick Century had seen better days. Its once bright blue paint now faded to a dull grayish hue, but it was reliable and familiar. Two things Harold had come to value deeply since his stroke had turned his world upside down. Settling into the driver's seat, he took a moment to catch his breath. These simple errands took so much more out of him now. 6 months ago, he would have picked up his prescription, stopped at the hardware store for those cabinet hinges Beverly had been asking him to replace, and maybe even swung by the library to pick up a new mystery novel, all without giving it a second thought. Now, just the trip to the pharmacy left him feeling drained. Still, his doctor had encouraged him to maintain as much independence as possible. "Use it or lose it," Dr. Wilson had told him with a friendly clap on the shoulder. So Harold kept driving, kept making these small trips around town, determined not to become housebound. He started the car and carefully pulled out of the parking spot, checking his mirrors 3 times before merging into the light morning traffic of Riverdale. The town had grown over the 53 years he'd lived here, but it was still small enough that he recognized most of the faces he passed on the street. Harold drove cautiously, keeping to the speed limit, his gnarled hands positioned firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as he'd taught his driving students decades ago, when he'd supplemented his teacher's salary by giving driving lessons after school. A lifetime of habits didn't disappear, even when parts of your memory started to fade around the edges. His route home took him down Elm Street, past the high school where he'd taught American history for 37 years before retiring. The brick building looked much the same as it always had, though they'd added a new wing sometime in the early 2000s. Sometimes Harold would park across the street just to watch the students pour out at the end of the day, their energy and noise reminding him of all the young lives he'd touched during his long career. Not today, though. Today, Beverly would be waiting for his return. His wife of 58 years had her bridge club coming over at 11, and she'd asked him to help move the card table from the garage into the living room. Even with his limited strength, he could still manage that much, especially if he used the little dolly their son Thomas had brought over after the stroke. Lost in these thoughts, Harold approached the intersection of Elm and Cedar. The familiar streets had been part of his daily driving route for decades, but today, something went wrong. Later, he would realize that the stop sign had been partially obscured by the branches of an overgrown oak tree, its summer foliage particularly lush after the rainy spring they'd had. But in the moment, Harold simply didn't register the need to stop. He sailed through the intersection, oblivious to his mistake, until the flash of blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Harold's heart jumped in his chest, sending a spike of anxiety through his body. He'd always been a law-abiding citizen, had never even had a parking ticket in all his years of driving. Oh dear. he muttered to himself, immediately checking his speedometer. He'd been going exactly 25 miles per hour, right at the limit. What had he done wrong? It took Harold's brain a few extra seconds to process what was happening and what he needed to do next. The stroke had stolen away the immediacy of his reactions, replacing them with a frustrating fog that sometimes descended when he needed clarity most. He signaled and began to pull over, but he moved more slowly than he once would have. From behind him, the police siren gave a short, sharp wail, as if expressing impatience. Harold flinched at the sound. His hands, already unsteady on good days, began to tremble more visibly. He managed to guide the Buick to the curb, put it in park, and turn off the engine. In his side mirror, Harold watched a young police officer step out of the patrol car. The man couldn't have been more than 30, with broad shoulders and a confident stride that reminded Harold of the football players he used to teach, boys who move through the world with the unquestioned assurance that comes from youth and physical power. Harold's mouth went dry. He should get his license and registration ready, he knew that much. But where was his registration? His mind went blank for a terrible moment. The glove compartment, of course. And his license? In his wallet. His fingers fumbled with the clasp of the glove box, clumsy and uncooperative. The officer approached, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. Harold could see the shine of his badge in the morning sunlight. Officer Bradley, according to the nameplate on his uniform, stood beside the driver's window with his hand resting casually near his holster. A standard position, probably, but one that made Harold's anxiety spike even higher. License and registration, Officer Bradley said, his voice clipped and professional. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop. Yes, of course, officer, Harold replied, his words coming out slightly slurred as they often did when he was tired or stressed. I'm just getting them now. Harold continued to search through his glove compartment, papers rustling as his shaky hands pushed past insurance documents and old maps. The registration wasn't where it should be. Had Beverly moved it when she was cleaning the car last weekend? Or had he put it somewhere safe and then forgotten, as he sometimes did these days? Sir, I need you to hurry it up, Officer Bradley said, his tone hardening. License and registration now. I'm trying, Harold said, frustration and embarrassment coloring his voice. I had a stroke 6 months ago. My hands don't work like they used to. He glanced up at the officer, hoping for a flicker of understanding, but the young man's face remained impassive behind his sunglasses. Do you know why I pulled you over today? The officer asked, shifting his weight impatiently. Harold paused his search, genuinely confused. No, sir, I don't. Was I speeding? Officer Bradley's mouth tightened into a thin line. You ran a stop sign back at Cedar Street. Went right through it without even slowing down. Harold's eyes widened in genuine shock. I didn't see a stop sign. I'm so sorry. You didn't see a stop sign that's been at that intersection for the past 20 years? The officer's voice carried a note of disbelief, as if he suspected Harold was lying. My eyesight isn't what it used to be, Harold admitted, shame washing over him. And since the stroke, I sometimes miss things. I would never deliberately run a stop sign. Officer Bradley didn't respond to this explanation. Instead, he repeated his original request. License and registration, sir, now. Finally, Harold's fingers closed around what he thought was the registration. He pulled it out along with several other papers that scattered across his lap. His wallet was in his back pocket, which meant he had to shift his weight to reach it, a simple movement that now required conscious effort and coordination. As Harold struggled, he could feel the officer's growing impatience like a physical presence in the air between them. The small, everyday dignity of handling his own affairs independently, something he'd taken for granted his entire adult life, was slipping away under the cold, watchful eye of Officer Bradley. And in that moment, Harold felt every one of his 81 years weighing heavily on his shoulders. The silence between Harold and Officer Bradley grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, Harold managed to extract his wallet from his back pocket, the simple movement requiring far more concentration than it would have just 7 months ago. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his driver's license and handed it over, along with what he hoped was the registration. Officer Bradley took the documents, studying them with a skeptical eye. This registration expired last month, Mr. Jenkins. Harold's heart sank.
It did?
I'm sure my wife and I sent in the renewal. We always do it right away. His memory flickered uncertainly. Had they renewed it? Beverly usually handled those things now, but with her sister in the hospital last month, maybe it had slipped through the cracks. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Sir," Officer Bradley said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Step out? But why?" Harold asked, genuine confusion and the first stirrings of fear coloring his voice. In all his years of driving, he'd never been asked to exit his car during a routine traffic stop. "Sir, I won't ask again. Step out of the vehicle now." The officer's hand moved to rest more obviously on his holster, a gesture that made Harold's mouth go dry. All right, Harold said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It'll just take me a moment." He fumbled with his seatbelt, the simple mechanism suddenly seeming complex under pressure. When it finally released, Harold turned painfully in his seat and placed one foot on the pavement outside. Standing up from the low-slung Buick had become one of the many daily challenges since his stroke. Harold braced one hand against the car door and pushed himself upward, wobbling slightly as he found his balance. His left leg, weaker than his right, threatened to buckle beneath him. "I need you to move faster than that," Officer Bradley said, stepping back to give Harold space but watching him with undisguised suspicion. "I'm trying," Harold said, unable to keep a hint of frustration from his voice. "Like I told you, I had a stroke. My left side doesn't work so well anymore." The officer's expression didn't change. "Put your hands where I can see them, please." Harold slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, the left one not quite reaching as high as the right. The movement made him feel vulnerable and somehow guilty, though he'd done nothing wrong except miss a stop sign and apparently let his registration lapse. "Now turn around and face your vehicle," Officer Bradley instructed. "Turn around? What for?" Harold asked, his bewilderment growing by the second. "Sir, I need you to comply with my instructions," the officer said, his voice taking on an edge that made Harold's chest tighten with anxiety. Harold tried to turn as instructed, but his balance wasn't what it once was. He reached out to steady himself against the car, his movement slow and deliberate. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Bradley barked, suddenly moving closer. "I'm just trying not to fall," Harold explained, his voice shaking now. He could feel his heart pounding uncomfortably in his chest, and the familiar pressure of anxiety building behind his ribs. Dr. Wilson had warned him about avoiding stress after the stroke. "Too much excitement isn't good for your recovery," he'd said during Harold's last checkup. Just then, a car slowed as it approached them. Through the window, Harold recognized Mrs. Patterson, Martha to her friends, who lived 3 doors down from him in Beverly. She taught kindergarten at Riverdale Elementary and had been one of Beverly's closest friends since they'd worked on the town's centennial celebration together back in 2003. Martha pulled her sensible, gray sedan to the curb about 20 feet behind the police cruiser and stepped out. She was a short, round woman in her early 60s with a cap of silver hair and the kind of face that seemed perpetually ready to break into a smile. "Harold, is everything all right?" she called, her brow furrowed with concern as she approached. Officer Bradley turned sharply. "Ma'am, I need you to stay back. This is a police matter." Martha stopped but didn't retreat. "I can see it's a police matter, young man. I'm just checking on my neighbor. Harold had a serious stroke not long ago. You know?" "I'm aware of that, ma'am," Officer Bradley replied, though Harold hadn't been sure the officer had really registered what he'd told him about his condition. "But I still need to conduct my business here without interference." Martha crossed her arms over her chest, a stance Harold recognized from school board meetings where she was known for standing her ground. "And what business is that exactly?" "Harold Jenkins is one of the most respected men in this town. He taught history to half the adults in Riverdale, including our current mayor." Officer Bradley's jaw tightened visibly. "Ma'am, he ran a stop sign and is driving with expired registration. Now, I'd appreciate if you'd return to your vehicle." "A stop sign? That's what this is about?" Martha looked incredulously from the officer to Harold, who stood unsteadily beside his car, hands still awkwardly raised. "For heaven's sake, the man is 81 years old and recovering from a stroke." "The law applies to everyone, ma'am," Officer Bradley said stiffly. "Of course it does," Martha agreed, her tone softening slightly as she tried a different approach. "No one's suggesting otherwise, but surely there's a way to handle this situation with a bit more consideration for the circumstances?" Harold felt a wave of gratitude toward Martha, but also embarrassment at being the cause of this scene. Other cars were slowing as they passed now, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. In a small town like Riverdale, Word would spread quickly. By lunchtime, everyone would know that Harold Jenkins had been pulled over and was apparently in some kind of trouble with the police. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am, but I need to finish processing this stop," Officer Bradley said, turning back to Harold. "Sir, do you have any weapons or anything that might stick me in your pockets?" The question was so absurd that Harold almost laughed despite his anxiety. Him with a weapon? He'd never even owned a gun, had argued for stricter school security measures without arming teachers during his time as faculty president. "No, officer, nothing like that," he answered quietly. "I'm going to pat you down just to be safe," Officer Bradley said, moving behind Harold. "This is ridiculous," Martha said, not bothering to lower her voice. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and began typing rapidly. "I'm texting Ben right now." "Who's Ben?" Officer Bradley asked, pausing in his movements. "Benjamin Wallace," Martha replied. "Harold's son-in-law. He's an attorney with Wallace and Chen in Springfield." Harold hadn't wanted to involve his family in this embarrassing situation, but he couldn't deny a rush of relief at the thought of Ben arriving to help sort things out. Ben had a calm way about him that seemed to diffuse tense situations. Officer Bradley seemed to hesitate for the first time since pulling Harold over. He straightened up without conducting the pat-down. "That won't be necessary, ma'am. I'm just doing my job. And I'm just making sure my neighbor is treated fairly," Martha countered, still typing on her phone. "Do you know that Harold helped raise money for the police department's first K-9 unit back in '92? There's a plaque with his name on it in your station's lobby." The officer's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or the dawning realization that this routine traffic stop had somehow veered into complicated territory. Another car pulled up behind Martha's. This time it was Tom Baker from the hardware store, rolling down his window as he stopped. "Everything okay here, Martha?" "Mr. Jenkins?" "Just a misunderstanding, Tom," Martha called back, though her expression suggested she thought it was much more than that. Harold felt the weight of shame pressing down on him as more of his neighbors and former students witnessed his humiliation. He'd spent his life building a reputation as a dignified, responsible member of this community. Now he stood by the side of the road, trembling slightly from the effort of keeping his balance, being treated like a suspicious character. "Officer," Harold said quietly, finding his voice at last, "I made a mistake with the stop sign, and I apologize for that. If my registration is expired, that's another oversight on my part. I'm happy to accept a ticket for these violations, but I don't understand why this needs to be handled this way." Officer Bradley looked from Harold to the small but growing audience of concerned citizens, then back to the elderly man standing unsteadily before him. Something in his demeanor shifted subtly, not quite softening but recalibrating. "All right, Mr. Jenkins, you can lower your hands now," he said. "I still need to run your license and check for any other issues. Please wait here." As the officer walked back to his patrol car, Martha stepped closer to Harold, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Harold nodded, though in truth he felt far from all right. His heart was still racing uncomfortably, and the familiar post-stroke fatigue was washing over him, intensified by the stress of the situation. "Beverly's going to be worried," he said, glancing at his watch. "Her bridge club will be arriving soon." "I've texted her too," Martha assured him. "She's on her way." Harold closed his eyes briefly, torn between gratitude for such caring neighbors and mortification at the fuss being made on his behalf. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Officer Bradley returning from his patrol car, his expression unreadable. The young officer held Harold's license and expired registration in one hand and a small electronic device in the other. Whatever happened next, Harold knew one thing for certain. This was far from the simple trip to the pharmacy he had planned for this morning. Officer Bradley approached Harold with measured steps, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The small crowd of onlookers had grown to include Mrs. Grayson from the library and the Perkins brothers who owned the local diner. Their presence created an unusual audience for what should have been a routine traffic stop. "Mr. Jenkins," Officer Bradley began, his tone professionally neutral now. "Your license is valid, but as I mentioned, your vehicle registration expired last month." Harold nodded, the simple movement requiring concentration to keep his balance. "I understand, officer. It must have slipped through the cracks with everything that's been going on. My wife's sister was in the hospital, and with my recovery—" He trailed off, not wanting to make excuses. Officer Bradley glanced at the growing number of townspeople watching them, then back to Harold. "I'm issuing you a citation for running the stop sign and for the expired registration." He handed Harold a small electronic device. "You'll need to sign here acknowledging receipt of the citation." Harold squinted at the small screen, the text blurring slightly. Since the stroke, his vision sometimes played tricks on him, especially when he was tired or stressed. "I can't quite make it out," he admitted. "What exactly am I signing?" "It's just acknowledging that you've received the citation, not an admission of guilt," Officer Bradley explained, his patience visibly thin. "You can contest it in court if you wish." Martha stepped forward. "Harold, would you like me to read it for you?" Before Harold could answer, a familiar blue sedan pulled up behind the small group of parked cars. Beverly Jenkins emerged quickly, her normally neat silver hair slightly disheveled, her eyes wide with worry. "Harold," she called, hurrying toward her husband as quickly as her arthritic knees would allow. At 79, Beverly moved more slowly than she once had, but there was nothing slow about the fierce protectiveness in her expression as she took in the scene. "I'm all right, Bev," Harold assured her, feeling both relief at her presence and shame that she had to see him like this. Beverly took her place beside her husband, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that was both supportive and possessive. "What's going on here?" she asked, looking directly at Officer Bradley. "Mrs. Jenkins, I presume?" the officer said. When Beverly nodded, he continued, "I pulled your husband over for running a stop sign. I've also discovered that your vehicle registration is expired. I'm issuing citations for both violations." Beverly's eyebrows rose. "And this required making my husband stand out in the heat? A man who had a stroke 6 months ago and still has mobility issues?" "Standard procedure, ma'am," Officer Bradley replied, though his tone lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "Well, your standard procedure seems poorly suited to an 81-year-old man with health conditions," Beverly said crisply. Despite her small stature, there was something formidable about Beverly Jenkins when she was protecting someone she loved. Harold squeezed her hand gently. "It's all right, Bev. Let's just sign the citation and be on our way." All he wanted now was to go home, away from the curious eyes of neighbors and the embarrassment of being treated like a criminal for a simple mistake. Just as Harold reached for the electronic signature pad again, another vehicle pulled up, this one a sleek black SUV that Harold recognized immediately. His son-in-law Ben stepped out, dressed in the suit he typically wore to court. At 53, Ben Wallace had the confident bearing of a successful attorney, but the expression on his face as he approached was one of controlled anger. "Officer," Ben said, extending his hand. "Benjamin Wallace. I'm Mr. Jenkins' son-in-law and attorney. May I ask what's happening here?" Officer Bradley squared his shoulders. "Mr. Wallace, your father-in-law was observed running a stop sign at Elm and Cedar. His vehicle registration is also expired. I'm issuing citations for both violations." Ben nodded, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "I see. And was it necessary to have him exit his vehicle?" "I observed some behavior that concerned me," the officer said vaguely. "What behavior would that be?" Ben pressed. "Difficulty locating documents, slow movements, slightly slurred speech, all documented effects of the stroke he suffered 6 months ago, which he apparently informed you about." Officer Bradley's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm just following department protocols." "Are you?" Ben asked mildly. "Because I'm familiar with your department's protocols, including those regarding interactions with elderly citizens and those with medical conditions. Chief Palmer and I served on the Community Relations Committee together last year when those guidelines were updated." Harold felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched his son-in-law handle the situation with such calm authority. Pride in Ben's professionalism mingled with embarrassment at needing his help for something as simple as a traffic stop. Had it really come to this? Needing family to intervene because he couldn't handle a minor interaction with police on his own? "Ben," Harold said quietly, "it's all right. I did miss the stop sign, and the registration is expired. Those are facts." Ben turned to Harold with a gentle smile. "Yes, Dad, and for those, a simple citation is appropriate. What's not appropriate is having you stand out here in the heat or treating you like a suspect." He turned back to Officer Bradley. "My father-in-law will sign for the citations. Then I'd like to help him back into his car, which my mother-in-law will drive home. I'll follow to make sure they arrive safely." The small crowd of townspeople had continued to grow, with several people now recording the interaction on their phones. Harold spotted several former students among them, including Darnell Washington, who now worked at the local newspaper. Officer Bradley seemed to come to a decision. He handed the electronic device to Harold. "Sign here, please, Mr. Jenkins." With Ben steadying his hand, Harold managed to scrawl something approximating his signature on the screen. Officer Bradley took the device back and pressed a few buttons. "Your copy will be emailed to the address on file with the DMV," he said. "The registration citation will be dismissed if you renew within the next 5 business days. You can pay the fine for the stop sign violation or contest it in court. All the information is in the email." "Thank you, officer," Ben said formally. Then, with a hint of steel in his voice, he added, "I'll be reviewing how this stop was conducted. If I find that department protocols regarding elderly citizens or those with medical conditions were not followed, I'll be discussing it with Chief Palmer directly." Officer Bradley's expression didn't change, but a flush crept up his neck. "That's your right, sir." He turned to Harold. "You're free to go, Mr. Jenkins. Please be more careful at intersections." As the officer walked back to his patrol car, Ben gently placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "Let's get you home, Dad. Mom's bridge club can wait." "I've already called everyone," Beverly said, her arm still linked protectively through Harold's. They understood completely. In fact, Diane offered to bring lunch for everyone tomorrow instead. The small crowd began to disperse as Ben helped Harold into the passenger seat of his own Buick, a role reversal that stung Harold's pride but which he was too exhausted to resist. Beverly slid behind the wheel, adjusting the seat to accommodate her shorter stature. "I'll be right behind you," Ben assured them, closing Harold's door gently. As Beverly pulled away from the curb, Harold stared out the window at the familiar streets of Riverdale. The same route he'd driven thousands of times now looked somehow different. Less welcoming. "Less safe. I should have seen that stop sign," he said finally, breaking the silence in the car. Beverly reached over and squeezed his hand. "Harold Jenkins, don't you dare blame yourself. That stop sign is partially hidden by tree branches. I've mentioned it to the town council twice already. Still, I should have known it was there. I've driven that route for decades. And you've had a stroke," Beverly reminded him gently. "Dr. Wilson said there would be good days and bad days. Today was just a bad day." Harold nodded, but the hollow feeling in his chest remained. A bad day, yes, but one that had exposed something he'd been trying to ignore. How vulnerable he had become. How dependent on others. How quickly the respect he'd earned over a lifetime could be stripped away by circumstances beyond his control. As they turned onto their street, Harold noticed several missed calls on his cell phone. Word traveled fast in Riverdale. No doubt friends and former colleagues were checking on him, expressing concern, offering support. He should feel grateful for such a caring community. Instead, all he felt was tired. Bone-deep, soul-weary tired. Beverly pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. "I love you," she said simply. Harold turned to look at his wife of 58 years. Despite everything, the stroke, the daily challenges, and now this humiliating incident, there she was, steady as always. Not pitying him, not treating him as less than he was, just loving him through it all. "I love you too, Bev," he replied, his throat tight with emotion. Behind them, Ben's SUV pulled up to the curb. As Harold watched his son-in-law approach, phone already to his ear and talking intently to someone, he knew that this incident wasn't over. In fact, he suspected it was just beginning. The morning after the traffic stop incident, Harold sat at his kitchen table, staring into a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sleep had been elusive the night before, his mind replaying the humiliation of standing by the roadside, neighbors watching as he was treated like a suspect rather than a respected community elder. "You need to eat something," Beverly said gently, placing a plate with toast and scrambled eggs in front of him. "Take your medication." Harold nodded absently, though the thought of food held no appeal. The local newspaper lay folded beside his plate, unopened. He'd been a dedicated reader of the Riverdale Gazette for over 50 years, but today he couldn't bring himself to look at it, afraid of what might be printed there about yesterday's events. The doorbell rang and Beverly hurried to answer it. Harold heard the low murmur of voices in the entryway before his wife returned to the kitchen. followed by Chief Palmer of the Riverdale Police Department. Chief Robert Palmer was a tall man in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and a face weathered by years of service. Unlike Officer Bradley, he wore plain clothes today, a button-down shirt and slacks rather than a uniform. Harold had known Bob Palmer for decades. They'd served together on various town committees over the years, and the chief's daughter had been in Harold's AP history class nearly 30 years ago. "Harold," the chief said, extending his hand, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." Harold rose slowly from his chair, accepting the handshake with as firm a grip as he could manage. "Not at all, Bob. Please have a seat." He gestured to an empty chair at the table. "Coffee?" Beverly offered. "Thank you, that would be wonderful," Chief Palmer replied, settling into the chair across from Harold. An awkward silence fell over the kitchen as Beverly busied herself with pouring coffee. The weight of yesterday's events hung in the air between the two men. Chief Palmer finally broke the silence. "I received a call from your son-in-law last night." Harold nodded. That didn't surprise him. Ben had promised to follow up on the incident. "I figured he might reach out to you." He was concerned about how the traffic stop was handled, the chief continued, accepting the mug Beverly placed before him with a nod of thanks. "I've also received calls from Martha Patterson, Tom Baker, and about a dozen other citizens. And I've seen the video." "Video?" Harold asked, confused. "Several of your neighbors recorded parts of the incident on their phones. One of those videos was posted to the community Facebook group last night." The chief took a sip of his coffee before adding, "It's been shared over 200 times. Harold closed his eyes briefly, a wave of fresh embarrassment washing over him. The thought of people watching his humiliation online was almost unbearable. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "The thing is, Harold," Chief Palmer said, leaning forward slightly, "the video doesn't make my department look good. Officer Bradley is relatively new to the force, transferred from Springfield PD about 6 months ago. He followed standard procedure for a traffic stop. But standard procedure shouldn't apply to an elderly man who can barely stand on his own," Beverly interjected, her voice sharp with lingering anger as she took a seat beside her husband. Chief Palmer nodded slowly. "You're right, Mrs. Jenkins. We have guidelines for interactions with elderly citizens and those with medical conditions. Those guidelines weren't followed yesterday, and for that, I want to personally apologize to both of you." Harold looked up, meeting the chief's eyes. The apology was unexpected, and he wasn't quite sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to simply accept it, to put the whole unpleasant incident behind him, but another part, the part that had spent his career standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, wouldn't let him dismiss the matter so easily. "I appreciate that, Bob," he said carefully. "But this isn't just about me. What happens the next time Officer Bradley pulls over someone who's elderly or disabled? What happens if that person doesn't have neighbors or family members to intervene?" The chief nodded, seeming to have anticipated this response. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'd like your help in addressing this issue department-wide." "My help?" Harold asked, surprised. "Yes. We're implementing a mandatory training program on interacting with elderly citizens and those with medical conditions. I'd like you to speak to our officers as part of that training, to give them perspective from the other side of the encounter." Harold sat back in his chair, considering the request. The thought of standing in front of a room full of police officers recounting his experience made his stomach tighten. Yet there was also something appealing about the idea of turning yesterday's humiliation into something constructive. "I'll need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Chief Palmer replied. "Take all the time you need." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "There's one more thing. I've reviewed the citations issued yesterday. The registration violation has been dismissed. You have 2 weeks to renew rather than the standard 5 days. And given the circumstances with the stop sign being partially obscured by tree branches, I've voided the other citation as well." Harold shook his head. "That's not necessary, Bob. I did miss the stop sign, regardless of whether it was partially hidden. The town's maintenance department inspected the intersection this morning," Chief Palmer explained. "The sign is indeed obscured by overgrown branches, a safety hazard that should have been addressed by the town. We can't in good conscience fine citizens for missing a sign that isn't properly visible." Before Harold could respond, the doorbell rang again. Beverly excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with Ben, who looked surprised to see the police chief sitting at his in-law's kitchen table. "Chief Palmer," Ben said, extending his hand. "I was planning to stop by your office this afternoon." "I thought I'd save you the trip," the chief replied with a slight smile, standing to shake Ben's hand. "I was just explaining to your father-in-law that both citations have been dismissed, and I've offered a personal apology for how the situation was handled." Ben raised an eyebrow, glancing at Harold. "That's a good start," Chief Palmer nodded. "I've also invited Mr. Jenkins to participate in a new training program for our officers. And Officer Bradley will be required to complete additional training before handling traffic stops independently again." "What about a public apology?" Ben asked. "The video of this incident has been widely shared. A lot of people in this community are upset about how a respected citizen was treated." The chief hesitated. "I'd have to discuss that with the town attorney. There could be liability considerations." Harold cleared his throat. "I don't need a public apology, Ben. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Ben looked like he wanted to argue but respected his father-in-law's wishes. "All right, Dad, if that's how you feel." "It is," Harold said firmly. He turned back to Chief Palmer. "I'll do the training program, not just for the police department but for the community. There needs to be better understanding on both sides." The chief nodded, obvious relief crossing his features. "Thank you, Harold. That's very generous, especially given the circumstances." After Chief Palmer left, promising to be in touch about scheduling the training session, Ben sat down at the kitchen table with Harold and Beverly. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" he asked. "You don't owe them anything." Harold considered the question, gazing out the kitchen window at the familiar backyard where he and Beverly had watched their children and grandchildren play over the decades. "It's not about owing anyone anything. It's about doing what's right." "You always taught us to stand up for what's right," came a voice from the doorway. Harold looked up to see his daughter, Catherine, standing there. At 55, she looked so much like Beverly had at that age that it sometimes startled him. "Katie," he said warmly, as she crossed the room to embrace him. "I didn't know you were coming today." "Ben called me last night," she explained, pulling up a chair. "I drove in first thing this morning. I would have been here yesterday if I'd known what was happening." "It all happened so fast," Beverly said. "And your father didn't want a big fuss." Catherine shook her head, a familiar, determined expression crossing her face. "Well, I think there should be a big fuss. Dad deserves better than to be treated that way by someone who's supposed to protect and serve this community." "The chief has apologized," Harold reminded her, "and dismissed the citations." "That's the bare minimum," Catherine replied. "What about all the other elderly people in town? What about Mrs. Hernandez down the street who barely speaks English? What would happen to her in that situation?" Harold nodded slowly. His daughter had always been passionate about justice, even as a child. "That's why I agreed to help with the training program, to try to make sure this doesn't happen to others." Catherine's expression softened. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Dad? Even now?" "I suppose so," Harold admitted with a small smile. "Old habits die hard." The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell yet again. Beverly sighed as she rose to answer it. "We haven't had this many visitors in months," she remarked. She returned a moment later with Darnell Washington, the reporter from the Riverdale Gazette, whom Harold had spotted among the onlookers the day before. In his early 30s, Darnell had been a promising student in Harold's last year of teaching before retirement. "Mr. Jenkins," Darnell said respectfully, "I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but I'm working on a story about yesterday's incident, and I wanted to get your perspective." Harold exchanged glances with Ben, who gave a slight nod. "Why don't you join us, Darnell?" Harold said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I think this is a conversation worth having." As Darnell took out his notebook, Harold realized that what had begun as a simple trip to the pharmacy had somehow transformed into something much larger, a moment that might actually lead to meaningful change in his community. Perhaps that was a silver lining to yesterday's humiliation. Perhaps even at 81 he wasn't finished making a difference after all. 3 weeks after the traffic stop incident, Harold stood at the podium in the Riverdale Police Department's community room, looking out at the faces of 24 police officers. Among them sat Officer Bradley, his expression carefully neutral as he met Harold's gaze. The room was warm with too many bodies packed into too small a space. Despite the air conditioning humming overhead, Harold felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back beneath his button-up shirt. Beverly sat in the front row alongside Chief Palmer, giving Harold an encouraging nod. "Good afternoon," Harold began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "For those who don't know me, my name is Harold Jenkins. I taught history at Riverdale High for 37 years before retiring. I've lived in this town for over 5 decades, raised my family here, and served on various community boards and committees." He paused, taking a sip of water from the glass someone had thoughtfully placed on the podium. 6 months ago, I had a stroke. It wasn't the massive kind you see in movies where someone collapses dramatically to the floor. It was what doctors call a moderate stroke. But it changed my life in countless small ways that add up to something significant. Harold lifted his left hand slightly. "My left side is weaker than it used to be. My balance isn't what it once was. Sometimes I struggle to find the right words or my speech comes out slightly slurred, especially when I'm tired or stressed. My hands shake sometimes, making simple tasks like buttoning a shirt or signing my name unexpectedly challenging." He looked around the room, making eye contact with several officers. "These are the visible effects of my stroke. The invisible ones are harder to explain but equally real. The frustration of not being able to do things I've done easily my entire adult life. The fear that I'm becoming a burden to my family. The grief of losing pieces of independence I never thought twice about before." Harold took another sip of water, gathering his thoughts. The room was completely silent now, every officer focused intently on his words. 3 weeks ago, I had an encounter with one of your colleagues after missing a stop sign." He nodded toward Officer Bradley without singling him out by name. What should have been a routine traffic stop became something more complicated and, frankly, humiliating for me. I'm not here today to criticize or complain. I'm here because Chief Palmer asked me to share my perspective, and because I believe that understanding each other's experiences is the foundation of a better community. Harold explained how the traffic stop had felt from his perspective, the anxiety of being asked to exit the vehicle when his balance was uncertain, the struggle to comply with commands when his body wouldn't cooperate as quickly as it once had, the embarrassment of being treated like a suspect in front of neighbors who had respected him for decades. When you interact with someone like me, someone elderly or with a medical condition, you're not just dealing with the person standing in front of you. You're dealing with all the complex emotions that come with aging or illness. The fear of losing dignity, the struggle to maintain independence, the grief of watching your capabilities diminish. Harold paused, making eye contact with Officer Bradley directly. I don't believe there was any malice in how I was treated that day, but there was a lack of understanding that caused unnecessary distress on both sides. For the next 20 minutes, Harold outlined practical suggestions for officers dealing with elderly citizens or those with medical conditions, allowing more time for responses, offering assistance with balance or movement, explaining procedures clearly and calmly, looking for medical alert bracelets or other indicators of health conditions. As he concluded his prepared remarks, Harold felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation of that day had been transformed into something productive, a teaching moment that might spare others the same experience. "I'll take questions now, if there are any," he offered, expecting perhaps a polite query or two before the session ended. To his surprise, several hands went up immediately. The first question came from a female officer in the back row. "Sir, what would have made that stop easier for you? What could the officer have done differently from the beginning?" Harold considered the question carefully. Simply asking if I needed any assistance or accommodation would have made a world of difference. "Do you have any medical conditions I should be aware of?" That one question could change the entire interaction. More questions followed, thoughtful, engaged inquiries about how to recognize signs of stroke, how to communicate effectively with someone who might be experiencing cognitive difficulties, how to balance safety protocols with compassion. Finally, Officer Bradley raised his hand. The room fell silent as Harold acknowledged him. Harold nodded slowly. His daughter had always been passionate about justice, even as a child. That's why I agreed to help with the training program, to try to make sure this doesn't happen to others. Catherine's expression softened. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Dad?" "Even now?" "I suppose so," Harold admitted with a small smile. Old habits die hard. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell yet again. Beverly sighed as she rose to answer it. "We haven't had this many visitors in months," she remarked. She returned a moment later with Darnell Washington, the reporter from the Riverdale Gazette whom Harold had spotted among the onlookers the day before. In his early 30s, Darnell had been a promising student in Harold's last year of teaching before retirement. "Mr. Jenkins," Darnell said respectfully, "I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but I'm working on a story about yesterday's incident, and I wanted to get your perspective." Harold exchanged glances with Ben, who gave a slight nod. "Why don't you join us, Darnell?" Harold said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I think this is a conversation worth having." As Darnell took out his notebook, Harold realized that what had begun as a simple trip to the pharmacy had somehow transformed into something much larger, a moment that might actually lead to meaningful change in his community. Perhaps that was a silver lining to yesterday's humiliation. Perhaps even at 81, he wasn't finished making a difference after all. 3 weeks after the traffic stop incident, Harold stood at the podium in the Riverdale Police Department's community room, looking out at the faces of 24 police officers. Among them sat Officer Bradley, his expression carefully neutral as he met Harold's gaze. The room was warm with too many bodies packed into too small a space. Despite the air conditioning humming overhead, Harold felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back beneath his button-up shirt. Beverly sat in the front row alongside Chief Palmer, giving Harold an encouraging nod. "Good afternoon," Harold began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "For those who don't know me, my name is Harold Jenkins. I taught history at Riverdale High for 37 years before retiring. I've lived in this town for over 5 decades, raised my family here, and served on various community boards and committees." He paused, taking a sip of water from the glass someone had thoughtfully placed on the podium. 6 months ago, I had a stroke. It wasn't the massive kind you see in movies where someone collapses dramatically to the floor. It was what doctors call a moderate stroke, but it changed my life in countless small ways that add up to something significant. Harold lifted his left hand slightly. "My left side is weaker than it used to be. My balance isn't what it once was. Sometimes I struggle to find the right words, or my speech comes out slightly slurred, especially when I'm tired or stressed. My hands shake sometimes, making simple tasks like buttoning a shirt or signing my name unexpectedly challenging." He looked around the room, making eye contact with several officers. "These are the visible effects of my stroke. The invisible ones are harder to explain but equally real. The frustration of not being able to do things I've done easily my entire adult life. The fear that I'm becoming a burden to my family. The grief of losing pieces of independence I never thought twice about before." Harold took another sip of water, gathering his thoughts. The room was completely silent now, every officer focused intently on his words. 3 weeks ago, I had an encounter with one of your colleagues after missing a stop sign." He nodded toward Officer Bradley without singling him out by name. What should have been a routine traffic stop became something more complicated and, frankly, humiliating for me. I'm not here today to criticize or complain. I'm here because Chief Palmer asked me to share my perspective, and because I believe that understanding each other's experiences is the foundation of a better community. Harold explained how the traffic stop had felt from his perspective, the anxiety of being asked to exit the vehicle when his balance was uncertain, the struggle to comply with commands when his body wouldn't cooperate as quickly as it once had, the embarrassment of being treated like a suspect in front of neighbors who had respected him for decades. When you interact with someone like me, someone elderly or with a medical condition, you're not just dealing with the person standing in front of you, you're dealing with all the complex emotions that come with aging or illness, the fear of losing dignity, the struggle to maintain independence, the grief of watching your capabilities diminish. Harold paused, making eye contact with Officer Bradley directly. I don't believe there was any malice in how I was treated that day. But there was a lack of understanding that caused unnecessary distress on both sides. For the next 20 minutes, Harold outlined practical suggestions for officers dealing with elderly citizens or those with medical conditions, allowing more time for responses, offering assistance with balance or movement, explaining procedures clearly and calmly, looking for medical alert bracelets or other indicators of health conditions. As he concluded his prepared remarks, Harold felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation of that day had been transformed into something productive, a teaching moment that might spare others the same experience. "I'll take questions now, if there are any," he offered, expecting perhaps a polite query or two before the session ended. To his surprise, several hands went up immediately. The first question came from a female officer in the back row. "Sir, what would have made that stop easier for you? What could the officer have done differently from the beginning?" Harold considered the question carefully. Simply asking if I needed any assistance or accommodation would have made a world of difference. "Do you have any medical conditions I should be aware of?" That one question could change the entire interaction. More questions followed, thoughtful, engaged inquiries about how to recognize signs of stroke, how to communicate effectively with someone who might be experiencing cognitive difficulties, how to balance safety protocols with compassion. Finally, Officer Bradley raised his hand. The room fell silent as Harold acknowledged him.